Wow. You know, I've always said, of all groups, hackers know how to party, but of that subset, Aussie hackers know how to party. I'm so excited because I just got news moments ago that AUSCERT has been given approval for 2019. The conference is going to be here. It's going to be bigger and better than ever. A couple of quick notes. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the Kombumerri people, the traditional custodians of this land, and I'd like to pay respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal people present today. A couple of bits of housekeeping. In case of emergency, should it be necessary to evacuate the resort, there will be a public address announcement in conjunction with an evacuation tone. The primary evacuation assembly area is Acacia Avenue near the south side of the hotel. The toilets are exit left, and situated down the hallway. And out of respect for our presenters, please mute your phones or turn them off, but please keep your Wi-Fi going just because I'm having a lot of fun. With that, I'd like to introduce to you your Friday keynote speaker. I almost said Saturday because it's still my Saturday. Your Friday keynote speaker is a noted authority on vulnerability disclosure and bug bounties and is the founder and CEO of Luda Security. Please give a big AUSCERT welcome to Katie Moussouris.
Thank you so much, and thank you, AUSCERT. I come to you from about 32 hours of travel, so we're going to go through in the next 40 minutes the idea of resilience and the art of bug bounty maintenance. If I go a little incoherent towards the end, blame it on the jet lag. I was just in Estonia. So who am I? This is a word cloud from my Twitter stream, if you're not familiar with me, and these are the things that I tweet about all the time as being important. Today, we're actually going to talk about some of the myths around bug bounty programs. How many of you have heard of a bug bounty program? How many of you are running a bug bounty program? Keep your hands up. How many of you are thinking about running a bug bounty program? Okay, there's only literally one of you, so perhaps some of this sensible knowledge and some of the myth busting may have already percolated into your realm. But, so what do? I run a company, but I also advise lawmakers, the military, etc., in matters of cybersecurity in general. How can we scale what we already have? How can we build resilience into our plans for not just the current networks that we have to defend, but the networks of the future? I don't know if you noticed the common vulnerabilities and exposure counts, the way that we uniquely identify a lot of security vulnerabilities, while not comprehensive, has been doubling. 2017 had double the number of common vulnerability and exposures, CVEs, than 2016. How do we hope to keep up? So about 20 years ago, some folks that I grew up with in the Boston area, known as the Loft, how many of you have heard of the hacker collective known as the Loft? 20 years ago, on May 19th, 1998, they were called to the US Senate to testify on the fragility of the internet. Imagine how much smaller the internet that we had back then was. And it was so fragile. Today's internet is bigger and more complex than ever. We've got IoT, we've got computers on wheels. We've got all of these other elements that make the internet much more complex to defend. So we told them, as hackers, we told our legislators, we told our governments that we needed to take action to protect this internet that we were growing dependent upon. So what happened a couple weeks ago? There was an anniversary hearing, which I had the pleasure of moderating. So we still have a problem, but it's much more complex and unwieldy. And now it's no longer just a few software companies that are concentrating those CVEs, but actually companies and organizations that never thought of themselves as having to defend the internet itself. Yes, we do still have the same problems, and that is a wig. We don't have the same hair. So, bug bounties in general. This is something that I care about deeply because I created Microsoft's first bug bounty programs when I was a strategist there. And this was on the heels of Microsoft saying that they would never pay hackers to report vulnerabilities. Why did they say that? Because then and now, they had the biggest funnel of incoming vulnerability reports of basically anybody else in the world combined. Over 150,000 to 200,000 non-spam email messages a year come into Secure at Microsoft. So why on earth would they dangle some cash out and ask for more? So bug bounties are really important to me, but constructing them in a way that doesn't amplify the wrong kinds of signal, the wrong kinds of noise, is very important. So looking around the crowd, I think enough of you are of my generation or older that you know what this reference means, but I felt like I should explain what jumping the shark actually is. There used to be a show called Happy Days, and this was an episode that aired sometime in the 70s where the writers kind of ran out of ideas for this very highly popular show. And so the idea of saying that something has jumped the shark is really about saying that maybe it's reached its peak in popularity and there are no new ideas. And in fact, how did we get here, right? How did we get to this place in such a short amount of time in bug bounties becoming so much more popular over the last 5 years since I started Microsoft's program in 2013? How did we get here and how do we stop it? So if you think about it, we keep throwing more money at this problem of cybersecurity. From being a hobbyist hacker growing up to watching myself and my friends professionalize penetration testing. I was one of the artists formerly known as At Stake. How many of you remember? It was a pioneering company in application security. Okay, there's one person who remembers. But the fact of the matter is, throwing more money at this problem hasn't resulted in better security overall. We have not been able to keep up with the bugs we already knew about, and we have not been able to keep up with scope and scale. So everything is still kind of broken. And we haven't recognized the fact that it's not just about the knowledge of vulnerabilities that can keep us safe. Something has to be done about it, not just creating the patches, which was the battle of myself and my contemporaries in trying to get vendors to take security seriously as we were reporting these bugs. It wasn't just about getting those vendors to create the patches. It's the whole ecosystem, where we have a gap between the patch being created and available and this window of opportunity where attackers can take advantage of when those patches have not yet been deployed. How many of you have a concrete operational strategy for deploying patches in a timely manner? Not a single, okay, a couple hands. Wow, you guys did party really hard last night. Good job, good job. So I'm sorry I missed it. I did arrive late. I could have probably made a cameo, but I decided sleep was a better idea. This is what I've learned 20 years later. So what's happening right now in terms of that problem of identifying vulnerabilities? Well, Google keeps track of search terms, right? And dating back since 2004, this is what Google says about searching for the terms penetration test and bug bounty. And you can see that over time, this pattern of searching has conflated to a singularity point. This graph was taken maybe a month ago. So we're at a point where we're overtaking these concepts of bug bounty is overtaking that of penetration testing. Now, these two inflection points that I'm highlighting here are the ones that I personally take responsibility for in terms of enhancing the popularity of bug bounty programs. The first one was the Microsoft bug bounty program. And up until that point, only Google, of the major vendors, software vendors, only Google had started a bug bounty program, and they did so in 2010. Before that, it was pretty much Netscape, the Mozilla browser, that had started it over 20 years ago. And they were paying out a mild $500 per vulnerability. So it was almost as if none of the major companies knew what to do with additional incoming vulnerability reports, and so they held. Until I started the Microsoft ones, and I'll go over some of the strategies that went into that, into how to control that spigot of vulnerabilities. And then the second major inflection point happened 2 years ago, when the very largest military organization the world has ever seen, the Department of Defense in the United States, started a program called Hack the Pentagon. Any of you heard of Hack the Pentagon? Right. So one, the NSA said, we're never going to call it Hack the Pentagon. We totally called it Hack the Pentagon. But here was the thing. I had been working with the Pentagon since my Microsoft days, since 2013, helping them prepare for what was about to happen, where they had gone from making it impossible. it was actually illegal to report a security vulnerability, all the way to where they were welcoming hackers and paying them money. So let's do a little differentiation. What's the difference between vulnerability disclosure, penetration testing, and bug bounty, considering, the world using Google searches seems to be conflating a lot of these terms? Vulnerability disclosure and coordination is the overall process of being able to receive a vulnerability report from the outside, take some kind of action on it, and then communicate out what the results are, whether there's remediation, or there's guidance changes, or users need to take action, whatever that is, that's vulnerability disclosure. And there are 2 ISO standards that I was the co-author and co-editor for that govern these processes. Penetration testing, of course. How many professional penetration testers are there out there? I am a retired professional penetration tester, but that's where you hire people under contract to tell you about the things that ideally your own processes missed. And now what's a bug bounty? That's taking the penetration testing model and crowdsourcing it to some variable group of perfect strangers. I remember 20 years ago when we were at the beginning of the penetration testing industry, where there was no way that banks were going to let us, a bunch of unruly hackers with funny colored hair, come in and hack them. The same kinds of arguments have been lobbied against doing bug bounty programs, but I will agree with some of these arguments, and I'll talk to you about that in just a second. So there are a few bug bounty companies that have sprung up, these bug bounty platforms that make things easier, and they're trying to convince everybody that everybody needs a bug bounty. You get a bug bounty, and you get a bug bounty, and everybody gets a bug bounty. And mostly, I think a lot of people are looking at the success of Hack the Pentagon and some of these other high-profile programs and thinking, yeah, we'll just open the front door, it'll be great. And they're expecting something like this, maybe a little bit of a rush, but mostly friendly, fuzzy, white hat hackers. They keep using that term, white hat. I don't know of any other profession that goes Old West with their, with their characters like that. How many of you are pure good? Not a single hand. Pure evil, anyone? Anyone? Okay. So black hat and white hat are these strange terms, but a lot of people, when they are thinking about bug bounties, they think, okay, we expect a little bit of a rush, but it'll be friendly. It'll be okay. We won't be overwhelmed. They're just bunnies. They're white hats. But were you anticipating something like this, where you can't necessarily tell friend from foe, where the actual activities that are being done to especially your internet-facing programs, those actual activities are the exact same activities your adversary, who may be a complete enemy, is doing? Thinking about how does this affect your incident response team that has to watch for attack traffic, attack patterns, and respond to them and deal with them? How much of it increases with the addition of a bug bounty program? What about data privacy? Anybody here? There's a 4-letter word out there, begins with a G, yeah. So right now, everybody's talking about GDPR, but we always had a data privacy problem, right? This one just comes with a lot of teeth from the EU in terms of monetary fines, which is why you see companies suddenly taking basic data governance very, very seriously all of a sudden. But what about when you have a bug bounty program? Now, data breaches aren't on the table when you're talking about a controlled penetration test. You've authorized a company to basically act on your behalf, so any data that they find as a result of that penetration test is not a breach. What about a bug bounty? How well might you have to define the rules of how you would like your data and your customers' data to be in scope or out? What about protected classes of data? The US Department of Justice just last summer issued some guidelines that are intended to help organizations think through what data is in scope, how do I want external bug hunters to hunt for that data? Do I want them to do the minimum that is required to prove that a vulnerability exists, or do I want them to prove, quote unquote, impact? One of the most misunderstood areas of vulnerability disclosure scope and bug bounty scope is please do your best to prove impact. That picture of me testifying before the US Senate was on the Uber data breach. And how did that hacker choose to prove impact? By downloading 57 million records. I think that's a bit much, don't you? So Uber has only recently changed its terms to specifically prohibit that type of activity and tell the researcher that if you find some data that you weren't supposed to see, stop and let us know. But we are just evolving some of these standards because before we were thinking of these things as analogous with penetration testing. I've even heard marketing describe this activity as crowdsourced penetration testing. Further, from the hacker point of view, how many of you do any bug bounty hunting on the side? Maybe a couple of you, yeah. So how many of you think that you're protected if you sign a non-disclosure agreement? Sounds about right. If you were a penetration tester, that would apply, sure. But certainly not when it comes to issues of data. Even the Department of Defense, in their bounty terms, say, if you follow these scope rules, we will not pursue legal action against you. But if a third party brings legal action against you, then we'll say that you were following the rules. What they're saying there is that DoD cannot grant you bug hunting diplomatic immunity. That's not possible, right? It's not possible for anyone. So, what about the future? We are seeing more and more automated methods to discover vulnerabilities. Darpa did something called the Darpa Cyber Grand Challenge. Have any of you heard of that? So it's basically when it was a competition where it was full AI, and the teams basically wrote AI to find vulnerabilities and exploit them in other teams while simultaneously trying to patch their own systems and keep them running. All of it had to be non-human intervention after the initial launch. Now, when they had come to me with this idea a few years prior, it was only the first half of the equation. It was only, what if we could find 10,000 vulnerabilities at a time? And I said, you know what? Having worked in the Microsoft Security Response Center, in the biggest funnel intake process in the world for vulnerabilities, I can tell you that that would break them and that would break everyone else. It's like creating bug foie gras. You know, you're stuffing it in and there's nowhere for it to go. So they said, okay, great. Well, we'll just make it a requirement that they automatically patch everything too. And I said, yeah, I ran one of those competitions before we were allowed to buy bugs. We were trying to buy mitigations, buy a way for us to improve, and this was us as Microsoft, to improve the resilience of the platform. The problem was application compatibility and backwards compatibility and performance. How many of you have had to roll out, roll back in, roll out again, the Meltdown Inspector patches, right? I know there's pain in this audience. I see nodding. So the fact of the matter is, performance, application compatibility, those are the real impediments of deploying patches, right? So in the world of the future, where we're having more and more AI-assisted vulnerability discovery, rather than have the attackers dining on the bug foie gras that we have made for them, we need to think of something else. So platforms, right? The bug bounty platforms, I've mentioned them before. I used to work for one, and I partner with them today when it's appropriate. Those platforms are solving a couple of very important problems in this ecosystem, and they're valuable. But, they're saying we're going to manage the flood and pick out only the valid vulnerabilities and tell you about them so that your team can just concentrate on fixing things. Well, triage labor is the toughest job you'll never love. Triaging bug reports is tough. It's not that it's tough because it's technically tough. It just wears on you. I mean, think about it. How many of you made your start of your career doing some kind of help desk or tech support? You were never going to stay in that job forever. You probably wouldn't be here today if you did. It's the same with good triage. In 2007, Popular Science actually named the job Microsoft Security Grunt, which was essentially the triage component or the case management component of bug fixing and vulnerability disclosure, as one of the top 10 worst jobs in science. I agree with this assessment that it was somewhere between what elephant vasectomist and whale feces researcher might have experienced on a day-to-day basis. The fact of the matter is, this is a very tough job, and it's going to be a rotating door for any human being who is in it. So the bug bounty companies ideally will take care of some of that pain for you, but think of it this way. Microsoft was paying these Microsoft security grunts six-figure salaries with full Microsoft benefits. I doubt that any bug bounty platform startup is currently paying their triage folks that much. nor could they make a sustainable business model handling all the triage for the world at those prices. So you need to think about it past that initial layer of they take some of the pain away and think about, do I really want this function outsourced? Do I want to absorb the cost of dealing with and retraining my triage staff knowing that it's a high burn job? How do I want to deal with this? Yeah, so it does turn out there is such a thing as too much chocolate. Even with the cleaned reports, even if you've decided to go ahead and outsource the bug triage, you're still faced with the problem of actually fixing the bugs. And not just fixing them, but ideally, no bug should be wasted in terms of how much you learn from it. How many of you have heard of a secure development lifecycle, SDL, right? So even if you're not an organization that writes code and is getting bugs reported to you in your own code, even if you're deploying other people's systems, what are you doing to make sure that you don't make the same deployment mistakes over and over again? How are you feeding that back in to either your development or your deployment life cycles? What are the capabilities that you actually need? I could give an entire presentation on the maturity model for vulnerability coordination. I have seen no other maturity model in existence on building the capabilities that are not just engineering. How many of you have heard of some of the recent debacles in disclosure where companies have even started bug bounties and then ended up in the headlines for legally threatening researchers, for failing to understand that a bug bounty is not synonymous with a private penetration test that would, require a non-disclosure agreement, right? I mean, I mentioned the Uber situation where they ended up paying this guy, a Florida man. Why is it always a Florida man? They ended up paying this Florida man $100,000 to delete those 57 million records. $100,000 was 10 times their top published bounty amount. So what are we doing in terms of building the capabilities so that we act consistently? We're learning from our mistakes. We're analyzing the kinds of bugs that we're continuing to deploy and seeking to eliminate classes of low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities. Because quite frankly, paying for bugs and actually becoming more secure are becoming more and more of a disjointed concept. Bug bounties are trending. They are trending super, super fast. And the majority of them are identifying cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. Now, I, as a retired penetration tester haven't professionally pen tested in over a decade, I was hoping that by now we would have eliminated cross-site scripting vulnerabilities via better coding practices or frameworks or better testing methodology. A lot of this stuff is easy to find. Not all cross-site scripting, but a lot of it. And the fact that these bug bounties are making everyone look really busy, but they're really only hitting the very lowest of the low-hanging fruit is a problem. Remember, you can't pen test your way to being secure. You can't think about it at the end stage after you've deployed and hope to build something more resilient over time. You will burn out your folks. They will take jobs as whale feces researchers because it's a better gig. So not all bugs are created or fixed equally. This was from, and I have references at the end of this presentation. This is actually from some work that I did with MIT Sloan School when we were modeling the labor market for bugs. We created a system dynamics model for the labor market for bugs. And we actually had to kind of create a taxonomy because not all bugs are the same in terms of their complexity, in terms of their ease of discovery, and in terms of their ease of fixing. So the labor market, it turns out, is quite stratified. You can imagine there's a huge pyramid of people who are capable of finding that low-hanging fruit. It's pretty obvious, right? Very, very few people are capable of finding the most valuable vulnerabilities. And there is a limited amount of attention that they're willing to spend, especially in a competitive environment like a bug bounty. You think you're, as the receiving end, the only ones dealing with noise. The bug bounty hunters are dealing with it too. As these programs become more and more popular, the bug bounty hunters are competing with each other. Only the first hunter to report a vulnerability gets paid. So as you can imagine, as their skills reach the top peak levels, Those skills are highly sought after. Why? Why would they compete with others in a bug bounty when they can get a proper penetration testing contract and get paid no matter what they find? So what happens when you just launch a bug bounty and you're kind of indiscriminate about what it is that you want? You're just saying, report some security bugs. It's a mixed metaphor of insects on this slide for a reason, right? You might want bees, but you get ants. You might get ants who are riding on the backs of bees, but the point is you're getting a whole lot of bugs, often valid bugs, but of lower severity than you really want your team messing with. This has been the case where Apache server, for example, is being rewarded not directly from the Apache folks, but through the Internet Bug Bounty, which is an after-the-fact reward system. I'm a founding member of the Internet Bug Bounty Advisory Council, and we vote on things like, awarding bounty amounts to the discoverers of Heartbleed, for example. So Apache right now, they're not awarding their own bounties, but there is a bounty available. They have seen an increase, not in those high-end vulnerabilities that would really help make the internet more safe, but they've seen an increase in valid but low-severity issues that are taking up the maintainer's time and attention, and there are only a few maintainers of this open source software that are actually paid to do their work. They rely on a community of volunteers. You can imagine how this ecosystem is being affected, and it's not just for open source. So let's talk about some myths, motivations, and the markets. Raise your hands if you've never broken a law. Good, honest people here. Okay, I'm glad. So a lot of times, and I mentioned this before, a lot of times people like to categorize hackers as black hat or white hat. When I was a professional penetration tester, I often said, well, I'm green hat. I only hack for money, right? But that was a joke. I mean, the fact of the matter was, when banks were hiring my company as penetration testers, clearly we could rob banks, right? We were authorized to rob the bank. We could have kept some of those vulnerabilities and made a lot of money elsewhere, right? So money was not our purest motivation. So here's some myths, bug bounty myths, and they're in clear defiance of behavioral economics, right? People don't just do things for money. It's also a myth right now where everyone's saying, yes, you should have a mature process and then do bug bounties, as if it's a foregone conclusion that that's the best way, is just paying cash rewards to people. There were a lot of things that Microsoft did before they paid money. And actually, during that transition period of starting to pay hackers money, there were a lot of hackers that we wanted to thank who, basically had reported things before those bug bounties started. Non-monetary incentives are huge. Challenge coins are actually a thing that a lot of people go for. It's kind of funny. But at Microsoft, we were able to do things like creating Xbox avatar clothing, like a black t-shirt that said hacker, a little black hat, that they could wear, or a blue hat that their Xbox avatar could wear. And they went freaking crazy for those, These are things that only Microsoft could give. And they were, I think it cost my cost center $3,000 paid to the graphics designer one time. So there are many other ways to motivate people to come forward with vulnerabilities for you. And then that myth that I love, which is, remember I was talking about that labor market that's stratified, that there's this myth that you can outbid the offense market, that you have to raise prices because you're in direct price competition. But that's not really the case. Now, I'll go over a couple of examples from Microsoft to talk about that. But what's the truth, right? The truth is, they're not a replacement for penetration testing. There are things that you can get in terms of penetration testers that are, it's not just a quieter, safer, non-disclosure kind of way to receive vulnerability reports, but it's a way for you to actually control both ends of the equation, both learning about the vulnerability and figuring out all those different operational changes you might need to make internally to get better so that your next penetration test doesn't turn up so much low-hanging fruit. You're ideally trying to move from the low-hanging fruit, tons of vulnerabilities state to improving your internal processes to get to higher hanging fruit, fewer vulnerabilities, but more complex, right? And we all have a mixed matrix of motivations. I usually categorize this as compensation, recognition, and the pursuit of intellectual happiness, right? But from a hacker's point of view, every bug is like all of us when we come to a yellow light. We make a decision in real time as to what we're going to do in that moment. And there's a lot of different factors that go into it, right? We might have passengers in the car we really care about in child seats in the back. We may see a cop at that intersection. Or it may be 3 in the morning and there's nobody around and it's fine to just kind of go on through. Well, hackers will make just-in-time decisions about what they do with their bugs. And the idea is if you're sculpting a program that's supposed to be welcoming to them, whether it's vulnerability disclosure or a bug bounty with cash rewards, or something in between, you have to understand what their motivations may be, and a lot of it is that they want to see the bug fixed. Just fix the bug, right? A lot of it is they want acknowledgement, right? That recognition piece, compensation, recognition, pursuit of intellectual happiness. And some of it may be that they want to be hired. Now, the defense market for bugs can only go so high, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I just wanted to give you a quick snap of this system dynamics model of the vulnerability and exploit market. There's a reference in the back to the paper that we published a few years ago with MIT Sloan School, but the fact of the matter is there are more levers at play here than just money. Just like there are more levers at play that make you get up in the morning and do the work that you do than just a paycheck. Okay, perverse incentives, right? Ways to avoid them. So 1995, this Dilbert cartoon came out. And the morning after I had gotten back from my trip where I announced the Microsoft bug bounties, some joker in the Microsoft Security Response Center had slapped this comic on my door, right? Now, the run-up to creating Microsoft bug bounties took about 3 years of extensive planning, game theory, economic theory, tons of research based on our data. And so I knew that we were not creating this type of perverse incentive where effectively we were inciting collusion of internal developers and testers with the outside world. But how did we know? So on the left-hand side, you're seeing a representation of an actual slide that I used to convince Internet Explorer's leaders to pay for their own bugs for the first time in history. This was something where it was very important to my management in the Microsoft Security Response Center that the product team actually owned their bugs. So what are you looking at there? There was the white graph, which the little low squiggly line is IE10 real data, and that's how many vulnerabilities were reported to Microsoft during the IE10 beta period. Then you see a break in the graph and a big spike. The big spike was all those friendly hackers who were willing to report to Microsoft for free, but what were they waiting for? To get out of the beta. Why? It's kind of the worst time to tell us about something, right? And clearly, they had been holding on to their bugs. Well, the only incentive we were giving them was 12-point Arial font in a Microsoft security bulletin. If we fixed that bug in the beta and it didn't affect any other products, kind of the most valuable type of bug, then we would not hear about it until the worst possible time because we had created a perverse incentive. So I offered a traffic shaping solution that involved bug bounties. Put a bug bounty the first 30 days of the IE11 beta period, and we could pull those bug reports that were going to come to us anyway to a time that was the most valuable, gave us the biggest head start, and in fact, it worked. 18 bulletin class vulnerabilities came in that 1-month period at the beginning of the IE11 beta period. Each of those would have fetched on the offense market 6 figures. Total amount of money that I spent for those 18 bulletin class vulnerabilities was about $27,000 total. Now, again, as I talk to you about these incentives and the ways in which you can attract the right eyes, those highly skilled eyes, at a time and place of your choosing, there is a place for bug bounties. That second one, the giant check, went to James Forshaw, who received the very first $100,000 bug bounty from Microsoft. At that time, 2013, a $100,000 ongoing bug bounty was the largest bug bounty of any vendor. And why did we think that was sustainable? Because what we were asking for were techniques, not bugs. Techniques, not exploits. These were sufficiently rare And we paid our people internally who were supposed to look for those things enough money that they were too rare for them to want to quit or collude or do any of those bad things. But we did set that price at the going white market price. That was the same price that was the top prize for the annual contest, Pwn to Own. How many of you have heard of Pwn to Own? Right. So Pwn to Own that year, top price was $100,000, but they would have to wait for it. Ours was year round. There you go. So, going to the Pentagon. As I mentioned, I had started going to the Pentagon and advising them on how they might create some structured incentive programs or bug bounty programs or even just a vulnerability disclosure program for a few years leading up to the final launch. And these were the results. But look between the lines. We didn't know how many people were going to sign up to participate. Over 1,400 did. Look at the total reports received versus the valid reports. Now, if you think about it, this bounty program went for about 21 days. That's a staggering amount of reports to get through in 21 days to distill down to 138 valid issues. The signal to noise on that, pretty bad, right? Also, never start a bounty or a contest or anything like that at midnight. That bottom number, yeah, 13 minutes past midnight was the first bug report received. So what happened next? Well, we launched Hack the Army. And actually, right after this photo was taken, the gentleman in the middle was the Secretary of the Army, and he asked, so our challenge coin, I know the Hack the Pentagon challenge coin had some binary around it, and it said, I hacked the Pentagon, if you translate it. Could our coin for Hack the Army say, Hack the Army, beat Navy? Could it say beat Navy? And of course it did, and for the first time in 50 years, the Army did beat the Navy, so I think it was the hackers, I don't know, somehow. But let's look at the numbers. 1, number of participants. The lever that was used to control the number of participants was capping participation at no more than 400. And then you look at the signal to noise. Much better now, right? But it's still somewhat of an artificially constrained type of exercise, right? Also didn't start the thing at midnight, so hence the first bug report coming in 5 minutes later came in at a comfortable noon 05, right? So what are we doing now? The labor market for bug hunting is being shaped right now. As I said, there are a lot of these bug bounty programs that are coming out that are pretty much aimed at non-mature targets. That means that it's encouraging a bunch of those low labor folks or low-skilled labor folks to come into the bug hunting market. The stratification and wanting to actually get some of those highly skilled eyes engaged in this ritual, well, that's getting harder to do. And so now you see sort of gimmicky approaches like, for one day and one day only, it's a 10 times bug bounty day. Well, what does that do? That encourages people to do things like you saw with the Microsoft data. Hold until the next time there's a big 10x. So what's happening across the world? Well, right now, there's a lot of legislation and funding in governments that are proposed to mimic the success of Hack the Pentagon, Hack the Army. DHS is saying, let's go ahead, or the Congress said, let's go ahead and do a bill called Hack DHS, Hack the State Department. Just yesterday, I saw a report come out that said that 75% of federal agencies lack sufficient staff and process to even identify their assets, let alone know their risk. I'm sure this is not a strange state that you guys have never heard of before. This also affects private sector as well. 94% of the Forbes Global 2000 lack a way to receive vulnerability reports. So why are we doing this? Well, because bug bounties make headlines. And we see so many people repeating this, this myth that we can just open it up to more eyes and magically it'll be more secure. Well, tell that to the OpenSSL team with Heartbleed, where that bug sat in open source code undiscovered for 2 years. So yeah, it's about as effective as passing a law saying, thou shalt be secure, right? It's never going to work. It's not going to work unless you build the underpinnings and the structure to be able to handle these vulnerabilities. And if you can't handle the vulnerabilities you already know about, and right now I'm seeing numbers come in where 40 new CVEs are reported every single day. So, no, I'm not a bug bounty apostate. I am partially responsible for these things gaining popularity. But right now, I'm trying to separate the myth versus the fact. What these things are good for and what they're not. And in all things, we have to strive for balance. You know, when I was younger, I mean, obviously I learned to code when I was much, much younger. I learned to code when I was 8. I could have been a developer. I did take a turn as a Linux developer, but I discovered that I was much better at destruction than I was at creation at that point. But as we mature as an industry and mature where we have this staggering number of vulnerabilities to find and fix, and ideally eradicate that low-hanging fruit, we need to take a note from many different philosophies. I've just kind of borrowed one, which looks at the cycle of creation, maintenance, and destruction. If we are simply incenting more destroyers, what are we doing about the labor market in terms of finding people who are willing to maintain systems and people who are willing to build and create new systems? You know, in the United States, there are the top 10 universities that crank out computer scientists. Not a single one of them requires a security course to graduate with a degree in computer science. No wonder we keep writing some of the same types of bugs over and over again. No wonder it's 20 years after that first talk with the US Congress that Loft and myself came back to say that much of the things that we warned about are not only still here, but compounded with complexity. So what are you going to do? You've got to take some action on your own. Take a good hard look at where your processes stand right now. Try and eliminate your low-hanging fruit. You know, I see organizations all the time saying, yep, we're ISO compliant with this, we take security very seriously with that. But actually, the emperor has no clothes in a lot of cases, and bug bounties are not the way to solve it. How many of you heard there was a T-Mobile bug bounty that was paid out of $1,000 because there was an exposed API that was allowing customer data and location data to be pulled? Anybody hear about that? So you'd think $1,000, that was a great thing. Wow, thank goodness they had a bug bounty program. But if you just peel one layer off the surface, why on earth did T-Mobile have a process that would allow an unauthenticated API onto the naked internet? You did not need a stranger to tell you that was a bad idea. So focus on yourself. Try and figure out some of these areas where you are able to bring balance to your own labor force. Decide what's worthwhile for you to outsource. Some things are not safe for you to outsource to other people, such as bugs that take a very long time to fix. Now, I promised some references here. So here they are for you, and I have given permission to share the slides. But I want to thank you all for waking up early in the morning to hear about the idea of building resilience into your bug hunting and fixing programs. And I want to encourage you to take the learnings from this conference and every other conference that you go to and apply that filter of, this may seem like a really good point solution today, but how do I build it into a resilient program that I can repeat and improve upon for tomorrow? Thank you.
And Katie, on behalf of AUSCERT, I'd like to present you with this speaker gift, a special ceramic AUSCERT mug and Aussie chocolate coffee.
Ooh, thank you. All right, thanks so much. All right.
Katie. I'd also like to remind the delegates and encourage you to provide speaker feedback through the conference app. And at this point, next up, it's my pleasure to introduce the technical director of Mimecast. Please give a warm AUSCERT welcome to Alison O'Hare.
You make me a believer, believer. Hey, break me down, you make me a believer, believer. Hey, let the bullets fly, let them rain. My life, my love, my time, it came from.
thanks everyone for being present at this presentation. What I'm going to be talking today about is cyber resilience for email, and it seems like a really fitting topic based on what this event is all about, and also if you think about what AUSCERT stands for in terms of cyber security. This is just taking that notion a step further, so thinking about not just protection and detection, but also thinking what happens before and during after an event. You can't protect yourselves from every type of event, especially in an email world. So how are you preparing for the worst and making sure that you can recover? So my name is Alison O'Hare. I'm the Technical Director for Mimecast. And what I want to do is go through some of the aspects of cyber resilience. So a bit of a quirky photo here, but the gentleman that's highlighted at the right there is a guy by the name of Nathaniel Bernstein. He's the technical scientist at Mimecast, and really what is important about him? He was one of the guys who developed or invented MIME for email, which is obviously the ability to send attachments, and he actually sent the first attachment in 1992. So if you think about email, it's been around for a really long time, but it's also come a very long way if you think about how important email is to our organizations nowadays. So there are lots of definitions around cyber resilience. I really like this one because I think it kind of encompasses a lot of key pointers or key facts. The first thing is the ability to adapt. So as I said, it's not about necessarily being able to prevent everything, but do you have the processes in place that you can adapt to your scenario or the situation? It also talks about cyber events. So for a lot of us, we think about malicious attacks, but the reality is that there's also technical failure and human error which cause these events as well. External or internal, I think most of us think that a cyber attack, for example, is going to come from the outside world into your organization. But you also have to think about internal threats as well, with compromised users or malicious internal users. And then whether it's intentional or unintentional, and then focusing on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So that's your CIA triad, which is still the cornerstone of cyber security. So emails really come to a convergence of risk. And I think a lot of this is around is migration to the cloud. So all organizations here, I'm sure, are moving at least some services or data into the cloud. And that's a reality. There are lots of benefits by moving to the cloud, but you do create a monoculture environment or centralization. They say that about 50,000 organizations are moving to Office 365 every month, and that there are currently 100 million users consuming the product. Now, like I said, there are lots of benefits, but what you lose is the ability to benchmark or test the environment. And for some, they say, not only are you putting your eggs in the same basket by moving, say, OneDrive, Office 365, email, Skype for Business, but also you're putting your eggs in the same basket as everyone else. So it really creates that single lock to pick. So what happened if something did go wrong? It would be a real seismic event because so many people consume the product. Other aspects of email in terms of the convergence of risk is going to be threats. In the good old days, we were only concerned about spam and virus, right? But there's obviously been a whole lot of evolution in terms of sophistication and how deep they penetrate into our organization. So if you think about things like there was phishing, then there was spear phishing, then there was weaponized type attachments, and now it's really moved to a world of social engineering. So understanding the hierarchy within your business, but also the communication paths and planning that perfect malware-less attack. You also got to think about data. It's interesting for us as an organization because whereas last year we talked a lot about security, now with some of the regulations like GDPR and NDB, we're talking a lot about data. People want to make sure that they have that secondary copy, but also they have control over that data. And then users. Users are always going to be your weakest link. No matter how much protection, prevention, detection you put in place, you have to make sure that the users are aware of the risk because technology can only do so much. What I'm going to talk through is really the 4 pillars that we feel makes up cyber resilience. And with all this convergence of risk, you have to take an holistic approach or resilience approach. You can't treat all of these issues in isolation. There are 4 main aspects to this. So you've got your defense arms race, which is constantly trying to adapt to the threats that are out there. You've got your skills requirements, so making sure not only can you deal with the technology, but also how do you look at it analytically? How do you make sure that you can make sense of all of that information? You've got your business disruption. I think this is key. I think a lot of people, when they move to the cloud-based service, you lose a lot of your control, or you introduce risk that you would have had control over. So things like a DR site or having the ability to have a backup and restore functionality, you could lose. So you have to think about how do you continue to provide email to your users and other services as well, but also do you have a compliant copy of that data that's totally separate to the rest of the application? So why do we talk about a defense arms race? And it really focuses on why email is so important. And I think everyone here will acknowledge it's their key business application, right? You keep your clients happy, you're speaking to your customers, you're sending contracts, you're sending orders through, you have meeting invites. It all focuses around email. So you need to make sure that that's available. But as well, if you think about the world of cybercrime, they love email because it's such a key application. So about 225 billion emails are sent every day, and obviously that number is growing. If you also look at the key entry point for any threats in your organization, it's going to be email. And 91% of threats come through the organization start with a spear phishing attack. And then in terms of the volume of mailboxes, you can see that's rapidly increasing from 6.3 billion mailboxes today to they predict to be about 7.7 billion in 2021. So I want to visually represent this, really looking at these 4 key pillars and how to think about your cyber resilience strategy. The first, as I mentioned, is that defense arms race. So I've been at Mimecast for over 10 years now, and really what I've seen is that shift in terms of the trend from the gateway, where you had that email had some sort of viral payload, or there was some spam associated with the email, where we now move into a world of email-borne threats that really take that user's second stage interaction to kick off that next threat. So over time, we've all adapted to these types of threats by adding multi-layers of technology. And that is pretty good, right? But you're never going to have a totally bulletproof result. So first was anti-spam, then it was antivirus, then you're looking at things like phishing. That progressed to be more targeted in terms of spear phishing. Then you had your weaponized type attachments, which required things like sandboxing. Now you've got your social engineering, which is a lot more difficult to catch because there's nothing necessarily specifically wrong with that email. You also have to think about endpoint security, your web security, your web proxying. And then what about your insiders? How are you going to control the threat that could be disseminated internally? If we look at the trends over time in terms of email and start to the 1980s, they actually say the first virus was a creeper virus in 1971. It wasn't associated necessarily with email, it was about mainframes, and it wasn't malicious, but it had the ability to execute something. This obviously changed over time, and they say that the first recorded ransomware was in 1989, and this was delivered to UK magazine subscribers and requested payment to a PO box in Panama. But as more people consumed the internet and started using email, so the threats evolved as well. You had your first polymorphic virus in the 1990s, and in the 2000s, we really saw an increase in spam. Now, spam in those days was an irritation, right? A nuisance. It wasn't necessarily a threat as such. It didn't do anything malicious to the environment. And the spammer got paid on the number of clicks on a URL, but the URL didn't lead you to a credential harvesting website, for example, which we see now. But as people got more into the world of email, they then decided they needed to use a gateway. And a lot of companies started having some kind of multi-layered technology in the 2000s. We also saw viruses like the I Love You virus and the Anna Kournikova virus. I remember working for an organization in the UK when the I Love You virus came out, and it totally brought the organization to a standstill. Things have progressed. Now what we see, as I've talked about earlier, is your advanced threats. So 2013 was CryptoLocker, 2016 was Locky, 2018 was Base Striker. These are going to continue to evolve. And what's next? We look at homoglyphs and homographs with a combination of ASCII and Unicode text. And what else in terms of social engineering? Because that's where I think a lot of risks are going to be coming from as well. So one of the things that we're starting to look at is supply chain fraud, where the folk that you're dealing with in terms of consultants, people understand that relationship and their profile, and they're going to try and request information or money pretending to be from one of those suppliers. So the next aspect in terms of visually representing cyber resilience is a skills requirement. So as you layer this technology, not only do you have to look after the technology and make sure that you can manage and monitor it, but what about the analytical side? So with all these layers in terms of technology, you're going to be producing a lot of logs. You may have a SIEM environment where you want to feed the API into, but you also need to understand what you're looking at, because you want to have an holistic approach, not just around your email security, but about all your security applications. Then you need to get your board executives, your C-level execs on board in terms of understanding cyber security and cyber resilience. So how do you make sure that they understand how important it is and the risks associated with it? And how do you make sure that you're constantly updating your users about these threats? So this basically goes around a cycle. You've got to deliver the technology, you've got to make sure you've got people to manage it, you've got to make sure that your users understand it, but then you also have to make sure that operationally you can handle the logs and the results of what this is producing. So where are the deficiencies? If you're going to seek and look for IT roles that are currently available, in terms of IT security, there are a lot of roles, and a lot of them have been open for more than a month. AUSCERT had a report where they said that in the next decade there's going to be 11,000 roles available for cybersecurity because it is an evolving world and there's so much skill set required for this. If you looked at a Pentagon industry report, they said that 69% of those surveyed said that the reason for the lack of responsiveness was based on a lack of expertise within their IT team. And I looked at a report in terms of a simulated event where you obviously send out your users what would be a kind of spear phishing attack, and they said that they had a 9% success rate in terms of clicks, which is alarmingly high if you think of how much error that would introduce into your environment. So in terms of user behavior, you really have to think of it in two ways. Firstly, you want to do your simulated attacks. I think that's a great idea. Obviously, you're giving your user that testing point. But you also need to develop your teaching moments. So making sure that you're constantly reminding them, lots of awareness, whether it's posters, whether it's think before you click campaigns, but making sure that they acknowledge that there is a risk out there. So the next aspect of cyber resilience is going to be business disruption. So when you were on premise, you would have had a DR environment, you would have had some kind of high availability, you would have had backup and restore. When you move to the cloud, you often lose this. So how do you make sure that in the event that something goes wrong, if we acknowledge the fact that it will and it can, that you can continue to be productive, that you can make sure from a reputation standpoint, you can make sure from a financial standpoint, not just email, but other services are available. You need to make sure that you have a user base that can continue to work through user applications or mobile apps, for example. You have to make sure that you're also applying the policies and the controls that you would have applied if those services were up. If you look at when Petya or non-Petya came out, there are organizations, and I'm thinking of a particularly large law firm, that were brought down for 5 days. They ended up using personal email accounts, which from a reputation standpoint is obviously not great. But also when you're back up and running, you're losing a lot of data that would have been sent from those personal accounts. What does business disruption mean to your business, and how do you measure it? Pentagon Industry also did the cost of a cyber attack in 2017, and they said that 6.88 million Australian dollars is what the average cost of a cyber attack is. Now this is pretty high, and if you think about a smaller business, that could absolutely kill them and put them out of business. And it takes on average 23 days to recover from a ransomware attack. And if you think about the disruption, if you think about the lack of productivity, that could be quite startling. Lastly, in terms of cyber resilience is data. Data hostage, data compliance, data availability. You have to make sure that you have a secondary copy. If you think about things like CryptoLocker, if you think about ransomware, how do you make sure if something happened to that data that you can get a totally separate copy? The problem is if you pay a lot of these guys, they don't necessarily give you your data back, or they give it back for a period of time, and then once again they'll encrypt it. So do you have a backup solution? Have you tested that backup solution to restore? If you're in the cloud, do you have the ability to have that? And how do you make sure, from a regulation point of view, that you not only have a separate copy of data, but that it's secure and you have control over it? In terms of regulations, they say that it's acceptable to have a 4-hour RPO and RTO. But if you think about moving to the cloud, you don't have control. If they have an outage, you're at their mercy to resolve that outage. And it's not necessarily a full outage, it could be authentication that goes down, as we saw quite recently with Office 365. So how do you make sure that you can continue to work and provide that service to the business? Now, once again, going back visually, a lot of companies, a lot of organizations think of a defense-only strategy. So what they want to make sure is that they have good protection, detection, prevention. So, and you can get great technology out there, you can make sure that you're blocking as much as can be possible, but we all know with zero-day attacks that you can never keep up with it. There's so many communities out there, there's so many people who've got a lot of time in their hands, And ransomware as a service is a very real thing, right? You don't need a lot of skill, you don't need any money to be able to use ransomware as a service. You get a free help desk potentially, you get a shopping cart, you get videos on how to adapt to the technology and use it. If you look at things like Kali Linux, which is for penetration testing, or Metasploit, they actually have a database of exploits that you can use. If you go with a single cloud posture, you also need to think through this quite carefully. Of course, if you go with something like G Suite or Office 365, they're phenomenal platforms. But you also have to think about that broader holistic approach. So we've got a multi-dimensional problem here. How do you make sure that you've got the best of breed in terms of security? How do you make sure that you've got the necessary logs and information and control? They also have a great SLA in terms of uptime, but the reality is that we know that there are incidences when they've gone down, and that's when you lack control. There's nothing you can do but wait until they come back up. And how do you make sure that you have that copy of data? So we really think about this as being a multidimensional problem, as I mentioned, but it really requires a multidimensional approach. So making sure that you've got the best of breed in terms of security, and you're doing as much as you can, obviously, in terms of protection and prevention. But that also, that you're using the analysis, the APIs, the analytical stuff to analyze your environment, but also leaning on a messaging SOC, so you can understand the threats that are shared globally, and we have a really good understanding of what's going on out there. You also want that platform, so in the event that something goes wrong with your email environment, you have the ability to continue to work. So you have a continuity platform where you can automatically fail over, where your users can remain productive. And then finally, you want that second copy of data. So making sure it's fully compliant, making sure that you have control over it in terms of retention. And if you think about things like GDPR, the right to be forgotten, I think is pretty scary for a lot of people. If you got a request to remove all data about a specific individual, do you have the ability to do that? Do you have the process? Do you have the ability to prove that as well? So going back to the whole notion of cyber resilience and that definition, once again, it's about planning before, what happens during, and how do you recover after. And just to highlight, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the types of events, it's going to be your malicious attack, which we all know about and have spoken about. You get your human error. One example is an AWS engineer who was following a playbook to do an update, and it was just a simple typo, but it had a dramatic effect on a lot of that technology. If you also look at Telstra, they have outages. One of those was caused by an engineer rebooting a node. And then in terms of tech failure, you hear about Office 365. They have a 9-hour outage due to an EOP infrastructure update. So the reality is you have to be prepared for all of these events. One of the things that Mimecast ran at the RSA conference last year was a cyber resilience think tank. And they produced a report which I thought was really interesting. They took C-level execs, risk strategy folk, and they got them into a room and talked about what cyber resilience means to them. And some of the key takeaways were things like psychology change, understanding the fact that you have to be prepared for it, that it's going to happen, but you have to acknowledge the fact that, you can't protect yourself against everything. Looking at event types, which we've spoken about, your CIA triads, always focusing on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Being prepared, so having an incident response plan in place, making sure that you practice it. Do you know what would happen in the event that there was a malicious attack or there was an outage of some sort? And then humans. How do you address the issue of humans? Making sure that your users are constantly aware of the threats and what they can do. So just to kind of sum up, in terms of the key resilience outcomes for cyber resilience, really the key takeaway for me is making sure that you understand how you would continue to work in the event of something going wrong. Because if your systems were down, not just from an email point of view, but if your systems were down, if there was a malicious attack, if your data was corrupted or encrypted, how do you make sure that your users can work? Because the key thing is if users are working, they're remaining productive, the business continues. You want to make sure it's seamless, you want to make sure that you've got end user tools, you want to make sure that you've got that control. And that basically means that you can survive through the event and then obviously adapt to that process and then continue. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. And just would like to thank you, and on behalf of AUSCERT, we'll also have a wonderful speaker gift for you as well. I'd also like to encourage all of the delegates to provide feedback using the conference app, and also like to thank the sponsors for making this AUSCERT conference possible. You are all encouraged to come and join the speed debate at 3:45. That's also where prizes will be drawn. And at this point, we're going to reconfigure the room, so please make your way to the rest of the conference and enjoy. Thank you.